More moves are undoubtedly on the way for the Pittsburgh Penguins, but the players other teams are interested in and the players the Penguins are interested in trading are two completely different things. We're going to dive into what players I expect to be traded before the deadline and what players the Penguins will keep in order to maintain some success leading into their future. All of these young players at Wilkes-Barre-Scranton are eventually going to get an opportunity, but there still has to be players on the roster right now that are part of the solution, not part of the problem. We're going to dive deep into that on today's episode of Penguins Digest. Thank you guys for joining me here today. First and foremost, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Most of you have not yet subscribed, and if you want the latest Pittsburgh Penguins content, subscribe to Penguins Digest and we got you covered. We also have an injury update on Evgeni Malkin coming up later in the video, but first we have to talk about trades because it is a pressing issue right now. The Penguins, one of the hottest teams in the National Hockey League as far as the trade market. The hot stove is hot, ladies and gentlemen. Do not put your hand on the stove. It will burn you. I promise you. Let's jump into the video. Teams are calling about racks and bunts, and this is not something that we want to talk about because these are two cornerstone pieces to this team right now, Rickard, Rakell, and Michael Bunting. These are guys we don't want to get rid of. We would rather not have to trade them, but they have so much value because of their term, because of their salary, and because of their production. So teams, of course, would be interested in Rickard, Rakell, and Michael Bunting. I don't blame them one bit. A report from earlier today said that the Penguins are receiving a ton of interest in these two intriguing players that have been lights out for the Penguins all season long. Rickard Rakell scoring like a monster on a line with Sidney Crosby and Michael Bunting. Power play extraordinaire. I keep calling him that because, oh my gosh, I didn't expect Bunting to be this guy that he has become for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Rakell, Bunting, both having great seasons in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is hesitant to trade them, but the interest around the league, it's tough for Kyle Dubas. He's in a dilemma. Does he want to hang on to these pieces, or does he want to maximize the value that they hold at this given state? There are teams up to the deadline that are going to be really interested in players like Michael Bunting and Rickard Rakell, and Dubas is going to have some big decisions to make. So right now, the Penguins pulling the trigger on different trades. Pettersson, O'Connor, already gone, and they're not done dealing. David Pagnotta revealed a few different times that the team is still receiving significant trade interest, mainly for Michael Bunting and Rickard Rakell. So this is something that we have to keep an eye on as we lead up to the trade deadline. If the Penguins win games, I think it's less likely that these two are moved because that means our win now window is still a little bit open. But a lot of people want to close the door on that and say, hey, let's really start to dive into this rebuild and focus on the future and younger players, whereas Rakell and Bunting are arguably in the prime of their career. Some people argued when Jake Guentzel was traded that we didn't get enough, but if you look back at that trade and the prospects that we got in return, these guys are almost NHL ready. I mean, these players are dominating at the AHL level, and it's only a matter of time before they start making an impact on the big club as well. So the Jake Guentzel trade actually really furthered our rebuild quite a few years, I would say. Justin Koivunen, Ponomarev. I mean, these are guys that are going to really help the Penguins in the next few years. And that's the type of guys that you're going to get in a trade for Rakell or Bunting. You're looking at prospects and draft picks right now. You're not looking at NHL-ready players like Kyle Dubas is thinking about going after, these young players. Those are the type of players you trade assets for. Bunting and Rakell are the type of players you trade assets for. So if the Penguins decide to move them, they're going to get significant trade value in return. And as Pittsburgh continues to consider all possibilities, if there are trades that they cannot refuse, they will absolutely consider pulling the trigger before the March 7th trade deadline. It's not a guarantee, but it is a possibility, and it's worth mentioning. So now we get into the meat of the video, which is what players are actually going to be traded. And that is a completely different conversation than what we were just having about the players that may or may not be traded. This is the players that are most likely to be traded off of the Pittsburgh Penguins prior to the deadline. You have to really look into the UFAs, the pending players that don't have many years of term to their contracts, players that are going to be free agents anyways and are going to be fair game for any team to go inside. So for the Penguins, they're looking at maximizing the value of these players and turning that into assets and into draft capital for teams that are desperately trying to compete for a playoff spot and for a Stanley Cup. So the players are as follows. We're going to start with a forward, Anthony Beauvillier. And I mentioned him in a previous video, talked about Beau being a guy that Dubas would definitely trade away. Obviously, I could see a scenario where he is a future player here in Pittsburgh. The Penguins fans love him. The team loves him. He has good chemistry with Sidney Crosby. Beauvillier, he's a decent player. But you have to consider that you could probably get more value for him now. And then if you really want to keep him, you can sign him in free agency. You think about what options Kyle Dubas has, and he's mentioned before, he's willing to trade veterans, he's willing to trade UFAs. These players fit both. And with Anthony Beauvillier, what he brings to the table, the type of energy he plays with, the speed that he plays with, he could be a big boost to any team's either top 6, he could be a bottom 6. It doesn't matter. He's just a good role player. And then an affordable salary as well. Yes, he's a rental, but he's not going to cost your team that much money. And the Penguins would probably be willing to retain half that salary as well. If it really takes that to get a deal done, they could get a decent prospect or draft pick or both for Anthony Beauvillier. So I would highly consider moving him. He was in a trade video that I made a little while back. I would rather trade him than Drew O'Connor. Now that O'Connor's gone, does that open the door for Beauvillier to stay? That's very possible. But I do think the Penguins need to strongly consider where they're at right now and the fact that they are going to be fighting tooth and nail for a playoff spot either way this season. And keeping a guy like Anthony Beauvillier just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think he has to be traded. I think you can get decent value for him. I'm not saying anything super crazy, but he is only 27 years old. He's still very productive. And I would expect him to be moved here before the deadline. I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves with Beau. He's been really good, especially on the line with Sidney Crosby this season. And when he's gotten that opportunity, he's really taken full advantage. Mike Sullivan and other sources around the Pittsburgh Penguins have had nothing but good things to say about Anthony Beauvillier. He's a guy that just goes out there and competes on a daily basis. And that's something that other teams are going to take note of. He already has 11 goals this season, and he doesn't play a whole lot of minutes, but when he is out there, you see him competing. You notice him. He's just that type of guy. He's that feisty, he's got the fire in him. And I think there's quite a few teams out there that he could really make better leading up to this trade deadline. As we look at the next player that I really do believe will be moved, and that is Matt Grzelcyk. Grzelcyk is the defenseman that is a UFA that has been very productive, especially on the Penguins' power play. He's been really the solution to fixing our power play over time, and he's playing some of his best hockey right now. So Matt Grzelcyk having a career year, point-wise, assist-wise, better production than when he played on the line with Charlie McAvoy in Boston. So this is a guy that's really in the peak of his career. We know what type of guy he is. He's a second-line defenseman, a top-4 type guy, and he can play on the power play, first or second unit. So I would expect teams to be really interested in Matt Grzelcyk because on tape, he's actually a really solid defenseman. He's a two-way guy, even though he leans more on the offensive side. He is a pretty solid defenseman as well. And I think he's shown the ability to do both, and that's something that teams are going to be interested in come deadline time because defensemen are at a premium right now. There aren't a lot of good defensemen available in the trade front, and that's why the Penguins got a first-round pick for Marcus Pettersson. So if they decide to move another left-shot defenseman that's a pending UFA, that's a veteran, that's proven that he can play those big minutes and do great things out there, he's probably going to get a decent return for the Pens. Even if it's just 2 prospects or a draft pick, I'm okay with that for Matt Grzelcyk because at the end of the season, you're getting nothing for him. If the Penguins really wanted to keep Matt Grzelcyk or Anthony Beauvillier, they're going to have to pay them eventually. And that's going to come in free agency. It's not like they're restricted free agents that the team has some kind of rights to them at the end of the year. They are unrestricted free agents, which means you almost have to move them. You don't really have a choice. I mean, the production is what's really going to tell teams, hey, this is a guy that can make your team better. I'm trying to basically sell them right now. I feel like I'm selling houses. For a defenseman to be getting 27 points in 54 games, I mean, look at the minutes Grzelcyk's playing. He's averaging over 20 minutes a game. When players have been hurt, like Kris Letang, when Pettersson was out, now that Pettersson's gone, we've had a lot of injuries on the back end this season, but the one consistent player has been Matt Grzelcyk. He's been in there every single day. He has been a warrior for the Pens, and just really helping the power play get better is the main thing that I say about Matt Grzelcyk because he can move the puck as well as anybody. He's a great puck-moving defenseman, can be very offensive-minded when he needs to be, and on the power play, he's a great quarterback. So I really do believe that other teams will be interested in Matt Grzelcyk because of what he was able to do with the Penguins power play, turning it around from look at last year and then look at this year with Matt Grzelcyk, really taking over for Erik Karlsson as that number 1 power play defenseman. That's something that teams really should value because special teams becomes even bigger when playoffs come along, and Matt Grzelcyk's the guy that you want on your side. Dubas already said he's going to move all the pending UFAs, at least all the ones that he can move, and I think Beauvillier and Grzelcyk are the 2 most valuable ones that we have, and they really do have to be moved. I don't see any other world where they are kept on this team beyond the March 7th deadline. They absolutely have to be traded, and that's why I did a segment for each of them today. Beauvillier, Grzelcyk will be traded before the deadline. I'm very confident in that. As far as the Penguins locker room reacting to these trades and reacting to not just the rumors, but the moves that have already been made, they're trying their best to block out the noise. And that is a report that came out earlier this morning. The Penguins locker room was asked about this. Kevin Hayes and Blake Lizotte were asked, well, what's going on in the locker room? How are you guys responding to all of this buzz going around? Trade rumors, actual trades happening, shaking up the locker room. This is not an easy position to be in as a player. This is a lot of adversity to face as an NHL player. You build relationships in any sport in the locker room, and when you start to see your buddies get shipped away because your team's not performing up to expectations, that starts to get in the back of your head. And you start to think, maybe I'm part of the reason why these guys are being traded away. If we were playing better hockey, we'd be competing for a playoff spot, and we wouldn't have to sell everybody. But now, you look at a completely different scenario for the Penguins. This is a scenario that they haven't had to really deal with until the last couple seasons, in the fact that they're actually selling assets here. So the Penguins were always a team that was trading guys away. They never had this kind of draft capital ever. I can't remember the last time they had this many draft picks, maybe the early 2000s, where they're able to see a return in these players that they were able to sign in free agency, the Grzelcyks, the Beauvilliers, Marcus Pettersson, that was a trade deadline acquisition at one point. And it's really interesting to see this different side of things for the Penguins, something that a lot of these players have never had to experience before. The guys that have been here long enough never had to be on a team that wasn't competing for at least a playoff spot. So it's very intriguing to see this type of thing change in the city of Pittsburgh and around this organization, being sellers for really the first time that we can recall. And it's not something that you could really be oblivious to as a player. Dubas is continuing to make these negotiations. There's no escaping it. It's online. It's in the newspapers. It's on television. It's such a sensitive subject, though. And Kevin Hayes said bluntly, it's not talked about in the locker room. And that was something that echoed the assessment from Blake Lizotte, Penguins forward. I think it's more on the outside, he said, in terms of where our focus and energy is. In this room and what we're doing here, this team is still very much focused on winning hockey games and trying to compete for a playoff spot, despite all of this outside noise that has been coming up lately and all the buzz that's surrounding this team for all the wrong reasons. So the positive note is that the Penguins are trying their best not to deal with that and not to hear what everybody else is saying and not worry about that. They're just trying to play their brand of hockey and compete on a daily basis, try to get themselves back in the playoff spot. That is the most important thing right now for the Penguins, is just continue to compete every day and not letting this affect their mentality moving forward. Gino is back skating again, and this is big news for Penguins fans. Evgeni Malkin has been out, but he's back on the ice skating again, which is a really good sign for the Penguins. They desperately need him back and his leadership. Penguins aren't the same without Gino, right? It's a much better team when Sid and Gino are both out there, especially with all the players being traded away. The Penguins are running short on reinforcements. There's not a ton of players that they can really rely on right now, and Malkin being out surely doesn't help. They got Tomasino back. Malkin's skating again. That's a good sign, but he is week to week. So we're still waiting on more updates regarding Evgeni Malkin. We want him to come back as soon as possible, but we also don't want him to rush it. And right now, he is listed as a participant in the morning skate, but he also did not appear to be participating in the regular practice session with the rest of the team. Second line center, number 5 scorer on the team this season, 9 goals, 25 assists. Started out the season scorching hot. Obviously cooled off pretty quickly, but it's still Gino. We still want him out there as much as possible, especially at his age. Injuries can be a little bit more devastating than they were in his younger years. But right now, we just want to see him healthy again and back out there for the Penguins. He struggled a lot throughout the middle of the season, so I'm excited to see him get back out there. Maybe this rest will be good for him. And I don't want them to rush him coming back. He was listed as week to week. Like we said, it's an unknown lower body injury for Gino. We don't know the extent of the injury, but the fact that he's skating again is a really good sign. So we're just going to take the positive out of that and know that he is going to be coming back hopefully soon for the Pens. They desperately need him. Like we said, if they're going to continue to trade guys away, they're going to need reinforcements. And Gino is a big thing on this team. Second line center, plays big minutes for the Pens on the power play as well. We need Gino. So it's exciting to see him start to progress toward the next step of his recovery and eventually come back into the lineup for the Penguins. And we're trying to compete for a playoff spot, right? We got the Four Nations face-off coming up. Russia obviously not competing in that. For Gino, he'll at least be back at the end of that. At the worst-case scenario, we get him back when the Four Nations face-off concludes, because we're going to have a lot of time without any Penguins games during the Four Nations face-off. But we're very excited for that as well. We get to see Crosby and Karlsson and Coach Mike Sullivan coaching Team USA. So thank you guys for watching this episode of Penguins Digest. A lot to cover. Put it into a short period of time, but we have plenty more videos coming up in the upcoming days. Daily coverage of your Pittsburgh Penguins here on Penguins Digest. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you on the next episode of Penguins Digest.